The fog hung low over the French countryside that September morning in 1944, thick enough to choke out the sun and turn the world into a grey, uncertain void. Somewhere in that mist, hidden from view but unmistakable in sound, came the deep mechanical rumble of hundreds of German tanks on the move. 300 Panthers, to be precise, each one a marvel of German engineering, each one designed with a single purpose in mind: the complete destruction of anything that dared stand in its way. These weren't ordinary tanks. These were the predators of the armoured world, equipped with guns powerful enough to punch through steel at distances that made other tanks look like toys, protected by sloped armour thick enough to shrug off most Allied shells as if they were pebbles thrown by children. By every measure that mattered in tank warfare, by every calculation of armour thickness and gun penetration, by every tactical assessment written in the manuals, the German force rolling through Lorraine that morning should have been unstoppable. Waiting for them in the fog were American tank crews, men sitting inside M4 Sherman tanks that everyone knew were outmatched. The Sherman's armour was thin compared to the German behemoths, thin enough that a Panther's main gun could slice through it like paper at ranges where the Sherman couldn't even hope to scratch the German tank's paint. The American crews knew this. They'd known it since Normandy, had it drilled into their heads in every briefing, felt it in their guts every time they heard the distinctive growl of a German heavy tank. The mathematics of armoured combat were brutally simple and entirely in Germany's favour. When a Panther and a Sherman met head-on, the Sherman died. That was just the way it was, written in the physics of armour-piercing rounds and tempered steel. Yet when that September day finally ended, when the fog lifted and the guns fell silent and the men could finally see what they had done to each other, the battlefield told a different story than anyone expected. The fields of Lorraine weren't carpeted with the burning hulks of American tanks. Instead, it was German steel that lay shattered and smoking, Panthers torn apart or abandoned, their crews dead or fleeing or captured. The Americans, who by all rights should have been annihilated in the first hours of the battle, had instead delivered one of the most one-sided victories of the entire Western Front campaign. The inferior tank, the so-called death trap, the machine that German tankers mocked and Allied crews feared was inadequate, had somehow turned the tables completely. Understanding how this happened requires going back, tracing the threads that led to that misty morning in Lorraine, examining not just the tanks themselves, but the men inside them, the doctrines that guided them, the experience that shaped them, and the circumstances that brought them together in that particular place at that particular time. The battle didn't start on September 19th when the first shells flew. It started months earlier in the decisions made by generals and the training received by soldiers, in the factories that built the machines and the philosophies that determined how those machines would be used. The summer of 1944 had been catastrophic for Germany. The invasion of Normandy, the breakout at Saint-Lô, the encirclement at Falaise, all of it had shattered the German defences in France and sent the Wehrmacht reeling backward toward the Reich. The Allied armies, American, British, Canadian, surged across France in a pursuit that seemed unstoppable. Town after town fell, river after river was crossed, and with each passing day, the border of Germany itself drew closer. For the first time since 1940, since the days of Blitzkrieg and triumph, the German army found itself in full retreat on the Western Front, unable to stem the tide. Adolf Hitler refused to accept this reality. He had never been one to accept defeat gracefully, and the autumn of 1944 was no exception. In his mind, the situation could still be reversed. The momentum could still be broken. The Allies could still be thrown back if only the right blow could be struck with sufficient force. He demanded counterattacks, insisted that his generals find a way to halt the American advance, and fixated on the region of Lorraine as the place where Germany's fortunes could be restored. It wasn't a random choice. Lorraine held strategic importance that couldn't be ignored. Beyond Lorraine lay the Saar Basin, the industrial heartland that fed Germany's war machine with coal and steel. If General George Patton's Third Army broke through Lorraine and reached the Saar, The consequences for German industry and the German war effort would be catastrophic. The Saar had to be protected, which meant Lorraine had to be held, which meant the Americans had to be stopped. To accomplish this, Hitler turned to General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, ordering it to launch a massive counter-offensive that would smash into Patton's spearheads and drive them back across the Moselle River. The plan relied on what had always been Germany's strength: concentrated armoured formations striking with speed and shock. This was the doctrine that had carried the Wehrmacht to victory in Poland, in France, in the early days of Russia. Mass the tanks, hit hard, break through, and exploit the chaos. In 1940, it had worked brilliantly. In 1941, it had seemed unstoppable. But this was 1944, and the German army that prepared to strike at Lorraine was not the army that had conquered Europe. The panzer divisions that had once been the pride of the Wehrmacht were gone, bled dry on the Eastern Front in the brutal grinding campaigns against the Soviet Union. The experienced crews, the veterans who had learned their trade in the vast spaces of Russia, who knew how to maneuver and fight and survive, most of them were dead or captured or worn down to exhaustion. In their place, Germany had created new formations, panzer brigades hastily thrown together in the summer of 1944, filled with young men fresh from training schools, led by officers who had never commanded armour in combat. They were given brand new tanks, beautiful Panthers fresh from the factories, machines that represented the cutting edge of armoured warfare. But a tank is only as good as the crew inside it, and these crews were not ready. The American forces waiting in Lorraine were something different entirely. The Third Army, commanded by George Patton, had been fighting continuously since the breakout from Normandy. Its component divisions, particularly the 4th Armoured Division under Major General John Wood, were veterans in the truest sense of the word. They had been training together since 1941, had fought through North Africa and Sicily, had survived the hedgerows of Normandy and the pursuit across France. They knew each other, trusted each other, and had learned through bitter experience how to survive and win in armoured combat. More importantly, they had learned how to fight as a coordinated force, how to bring together tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power into a single devastating whole. This difference in experience and doctrine would prove decisive, but neither side fully understood it yet. The Germans believed that their superior tanks would carry the day, that the Panther's thick armour and powerful gun would overcome any American advantages in numbers or coordination. The Americans knew they were outmatched tank for tank, knew that a frontal engagement with a Panther was suicide for a Sherman, but they had learned ways to fight that didn't rely on fair duels. They had learned to ambush, to manoeuvre, to call in artillery and airstrikes, to never give the Germans the kind of battle the Germans wanted. They had turned their weakness into a different kind of strength. The Sherman tank itself embodied this philosophy. It wasn't designed to be the best tank on the battlefield. It was designed to be good enough, reliable enough, and producible in numbers that would overwhelm the enemy through sheer quantity. American factories had churned out tens of thousands of Shermans, shipping them to every theatre of the war, knowing that they would face tanks with better armour and bigger guns. The Sherman's 75mm gun was adequate against most German tanks, but against a Panther's frontal armour it was nearly useless. At normal combat ranges, a Sherman shell would simply bounce off the sloped armour of a Panther without penetrating. Meanwhile, the Panther's long 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the American tank couldn't even hope to return fire effectively. Every American tanker knew these numbers, knew that their survival depended on never fighting the way the Germans wanted to fight. They learned to use terrain, to position themselves in places where they could fire at the thinner side or rear armour of German tanks. They learned to work in teams, with some tanks drawing fire while others manoeuvred for killing shots. They learned to dig their tanks into the ground, creating improvised fortifications that gave them protection and concealment. Most importantly, they learned that they were never alone, that behind them stood a massive infrastructure of artillery support, of fighter-bomber squadrons, of supplies and reinforcements that the Germans could no longer match. The Panther tank, by contrast, was a weapon born of desperation and ambition in equal measure. When German forces first encountered the Soviet T-34 on the Eastern Front, the shock had been profound. Here was a tank that combined thick, sloped armour with a powerful gun and good mobility, all in a package that the Soviets could produce in huge numbers. German tanks of the time, the Panzer III and early Panzer IV models, were suddenly obsolete. The response was the Panther, a medium tank that was really a heavy tank in everything but name. It carried frontal armour thick enough to stop almost anything the Allies could throw at it, mounted a gun powerful enough to kill any Allied tank at long range, and had enough speed to manoeuvre effectively on the battlefield. On paper, the Panther was magnificent. In the hands of experienced crews with good maintenance support, it was deadly. But it was also complex, prone to mechanical breakdown and difficult to maintain in field conditions. Its engine, designed to push the tank's considerable weight, was prone to catching fire. Its transmission, overworked and underdesigned, frequently failed. Its suspension required constant attention. For a veteran crew with time and resources, these were manageable problems. For the hastily trained men of the new Panzer brigades, they were often insurmountable. A broken-down Panther was just another piece of scrap metal, and in the coming battle, mechanical breakdowns would claim almost as many German tanks as enemy fire. By mid-September, both sides were in position. The Americans held a line running through the towns and villages of eastern Lorraine, with the 4th Armoured Division's Combat Command A positioned around the small town of Arracourt. They had established defensive positions, dug in their tanks and tank destroyers, and waited. Supply shortages plagued them. Gasoline was scarce, rationed carefully because the Allied supply lines were stretched thin all across France. Ammunition was plentiful enough, but not unlimited. The men joked bitterly that they could see the German border but couldn't reach it because they didn't have enough fuel to fill their tanks. Patton raged at his superiors, demanding more supplies, but resources were being diverted north to support Montgomery's drive toward the Rhine. The Third Army would have to make do with what it had. The Germans, meanwhile, were gathering their strength for what they hoped would be a knockout blow. More than 300 tanks, mostly Panthers, but also some Panzer IVs and assault guns, assembled in the forests beyond the Moselle. The 5th Panzer Army's plan was straightforward: mass the armour, punch through the American lines, recapture the town of Lunéville, and drive the Americans back in disorder. It was classic German doctrine, the armoured thrust that had worked so many times before. What the plan didn't account for was the quality of the troops carrying it out. The panzer brigades that would lead the attack had been in existence for only a few weeks. Their crews had barely finished training, had never worked together as units, had never coordinated with infantry or artillery in actual combat. They were being asked to execute a complex offensive operation with none of the experience or preparation such an operation required. The men inside those tanks were young, most of them teenagers or barely into their 20s. They had been raised on stories of German military prowess, of blitzkrieg victories and unstoppable panzers. They believed in their tanks, trusted in the superiority of German engineering, and expected that their Panthers would carry them to victory. What they lacked was any realistic understanding of what modern combat actually entailed. They didn't know how to read terrain, how to use cover, how to coordinate fire and movement. They didn't understand the importance of reconnaissance, of knowing where the enemy was before you attacked. They had been taught to drive forward and shoot, and that's what they intended to do. As September 18th dawned, the stage was set. The Americans waited in their defensive positions, veterans who knew the value of patience and preparation. The Germans prepared to attack, inexperienced but confident, believing that their superior machines would overcome any deficiencies in training or coordination. Between them lay the fog-shrouded fields of Lorraine, about to become the graveyard of German armoured power in the West. Neither side knew it yet, but the battle that was about to begin would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the war in this theatre, would prove or disprove doctrines that had been developed over years, and would demonstrate once and for all that in modern warfare, the quality of men and the integration of arms mattered far more than the thickness of armour plate or the length of a gun barrel. The night before the German attack, American positions were alive with quiet activity. Tank crews performed last-minute maintenance checks, knowing that a mechanical failure in battle could mean death. Infantry squads cleaned their weapons and checked ammunition. Artillery crews registered their guns, measuring exact distances to likely German approach routes, so that when the time came they could drop shells precisely where they were needed. Radio operators tested their equipment, ensuring that the vital communications network that tied the entire force together was functioning properly. Officers gathered their men and gave final instructions, reminding them of the plan, of the importance of fire discipline, of staying calm under pressure. Some men wrote letters home, words they hoped wouldn't be their last, but knew might be. Others prayed or slept or sat in silence contemplating what tomorrow might bring. The fog that rolled in that night was thicker than usual, a dense white blanket that reduced visibility to almost nothing. Men standing guard could barely see 10 yards in front of them. It was the kind of fog that made everything uncertain, that turned familiar landscapes into alien territory, that made every sound seem louder and more ominous than it was. For the Americans, it was frustrating, knowing that somewhere out there the Germans were moving but being unable to see them. For the Germans, it seemed like a gift, a natural screen that would hide their approach and allow them to close with the Americans before being detected. Both sides were right, but the fog would ultimately favour the side that was better prepared to fight blind. The first German units began moving in the early hours of September 19th, their Panthers grinding forward through the mist. The plan called for a rapid advance, overwhelming the American outposts and driving deep into their positions before they could react. But moving through fog with inexperienced drivers was harder than anyone had anticipated. Tanks lost contact with each other, platoons became separated. The carefully planned formation dissolved into a series of small groups blundering forward with little coordination. German commanders tried to maintain control through radio, but the young crews were overwhelmed by the stress of their first real combat, confused by the terrain they couldn't see, uncertain of where they were or where they were supposed to be going. The Americans heard them coming long before they could see them. The sound of tank engines carries far, especially in the stillness of a foggy morning, and the veterans of Combat Command A knew that sound well. Tank commanders alerted their crews. Gunners peered through their sights, trying to spot targets they knew were out there somewhere. Loaders made sure rounds were ready to fire at a moment's notice. The American positions had been carefully chosen, placed to cover likely German approach routes, positioned to allow flanking fire, supported by artillery that could be called in within seconds. All they needed now was for the Germans to come close enough. When the first Panthers emerged from the fog, they appeared as dark shadows, ghostly shapes that materialized suddenly at distances measured in dozens of yards rather than hundreds. At these ranges, the Sherman's gun could penetrate, could strike the thinner side armor of the Panthers, could kill. The American crews opened fire immediately, not giving the Germans time to orient themselves or return fire effectively. The carefully planned German advance dissolved into chaos in seconds. Panthers that had been advancing confidently suddenly found themselves taking fire from multiple directions, unable to identify where the American tanks were, unable to coordinate a response. Some tried to return fire blindly, sending shells into the fog at targets they couldn't see. Others attempted to back away, to escape the killing zone they had blundered into. Many simply stopped, their crews too shocked and confused to do anything. In those first minutes of combat, 11 German tanks were destroyed or disabled, their crews killed or forced to abandon their vehicles. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which had been leading the attack, was stopped cold almost immediately. The Panthers that survived the initial ambush tried to reorganize, to form up and mount a proper attack, but the fog that had concealed their approach now trapped them. They couldn't see the Americans to shoot at them, couldn't coordinate with each other, couldn't even be sure where they were. American tank destroyers, positioned in concealed firing positions, waited for Panthers to present themselves and then fired at close range, their more powerful 76mm guns punching through German armour with devastating effect. The battle spread across the fields around Arracourt as more German units entered the fight, each one hoping to break through the American defence, each one running into prepared positions and coordinated fire. Near the village of Les, 3 American tank destroyers from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion waited in a shallow depression, their guns covering a narrow approach between 2 hedgerows. When a column of Panthers advanced down that route, the tank destroyers opened fire at almost point-blank range, barely 150 yards separating the German tanks from the American guns. The exchange was brutal and swift. The first few Panthers in the column were destroyed immediately, blocking the path for those behind them. The following German tanks tried to turn their turrets to engage the American guns, but in the confined space and poor visibility, they couldn't maneuver effectively. Within minutes, 7 Panthers were burning. The tank destroyers paid a price for their aggressive positioning, with 3 of them destroyed by return fire. But the German advance on that axis was stopped completely. Throughout the day, the pattern repeated itself across the entire front. German units advanced into the fog, confident in their superior tanks, and ran straight into American ambushes. The veterans of the 4th Armoured Division fought with a discipline and coordination that the green German crews couldn't match, using every advantage of terrain and positioning to offset the technical superiority of the Panther. American artillery, directed by forward observers who knew the ground intimately, dropped shells on German assembly areas and approach routes with devastating accuracy. Tank platoons worked in teams, with some providing covering fire, while others manoeuvred to advantageous positions. Infantry supported the tanks, marking German positions and preventing Panzer Grenadiers from getting close enough to use their anti-tank weapons. By the time evening fell on September 19th, the German offensive was already in serious trouble. 50 tanks had been destroyed or abandoned, nearly half the strength of the attacking force lost in a single day. The Americans had suffered losses too, but far fewer, a handful of Shermans and tank destroyers compared to the pile of wrecked Panthers littering the battlefield. More importantly, the Germans had failed to achieve any of their objectives. They hadn't broken through the American lines, hadn't recaptured Luneville, hadn't created the breakthrough that was supposed to send Patton's army reeling backward. Instead, they had lost their momentum, their cohesion, and a significant portion of their combat power. The German commanders, shocked by the day's losses, nevertheless prepared to try again. They had been ordered to break through, to restore German control of Lorraine, and they intended to keep trying until they succeeded or had nothing left to attack with. Fresh units were brought up, scattered elements were reorganized, and plans were made for renewed attacks the following day. The problem was that nothing had really changed. The German crews were still inexperienced, still lacked proper coordination, still didn't have adequate reconnaissance telling them where the Americans actually were. They would be attacking into the same prepared defences, against the same veteran crews, with the same tactical disadvantages they had faced on the 19th. The morning of September 20th brought more fog, and with it more German attacks. This time the focus shifted toward Arracourt itself, with Panthers pushing directly at the headquarters of Combat Command A in an attempt to decapitate the American defense. For a brief period, the situation looked dangerous for the Americans. German tanks got closer than they had the previous day, forcing American units to give ground, threatening to overrun key positions. The headquarters personnel, normally safe behind the lines, suddenly found themselves in the middle of the fight, with Panthers approaching close enough that staff officers could see them through the mist. Then something unexpected happened, something that perfectly illustrated the American ability to improvise and coordinate different types of combat power. Major Charles Carpenter, an artillery forward observer, had been flying reconnaissance missions in a small L-4 Piper Cub observation plane, trying to spot German positions through breaks in the fog. Frustrated by his inability to provide useful targeting information to the artillery, Carpenter had come up with an unconventional solution. He had obtained 6 bazooka rockets and rigged them to fire from improvised tubes mounted under the wings of his tiny aircraft. The idea was to use the plane itself as a weapons platform, diving on German tanks and firing the rockets at close range. It was dangerous, arguably crazy, and violated pretty much every regulation governing the use of artillery observation aircraft. It was also exactly the kind of innovative thinking that the American military encouraged in its officers. When Carpenter saw Panthers threatening the headquarters area, he didn't hesitate. He dove his little plane at the advancing German tanks, coming in so low that he was almost at ground level, and fired his rockets at the surprised German crews. 2 Panthers were knocked out by the bazooka rounds, several armoured cars were destroyed, and Panzer grenadiers who had been advancing alongside the tanks scattered in confusion, not understanding what was happening but knowing they were under attack from above. Carpenter's plane was hit multiple times by German machine gun fire but survived, and he immediately flew back to rearm and make another attack run. By the end of the day, he had made 3 separate attacks, firing 16 rockets total, and had become a legend among the men on the ground who watched his tiny plane weaving through the fog and tracers to strike at German armour. The psychological impact of Carpenter's attacks was almost as important as the physical damage they caused. German troops, already rattled by the previous day's losses, now found themselves being attacked by artillery spotting planes, something they had never encountered before and didn't know how to respond to. It added to the general sense of confusion and chaos that was undermining the German offensive. For the Americans, watching this brave lunatic dive-bomb Panthers with a tiny observation plane armed with infantry weapons, it was a morale boost that lifted spirits and reinforced the feeling that they could find a way to win against any odds. On September 21st, everything changed. The weather cleared. The fog that had blanketed Lorraine for 3 days finally lifted, revealing clear blue skies and unrestricted visibility. For the American forces, this was the moment they had been waiting for. For the Germans, it was the beginning of the end. With the skies clear, the full weight of Allied air power could finally be brought to bear on the exposed German formations. The Thunderbolts came first, P-47 fighter bombers from the 19th Tactical Air Command screaming down out of the sun with their engines howling. They carried rockets and bombs and 8 50 caliber machine guns, and they used all of it on the German tanks and vehicles below. The pilots had been frustrated for days, unable to provide effective support because of the weather, and now they made up for lost time with a vengeance. They hit German assembly areas, catching tanks that were preparing for another attack and destroying them before they could even move forward. They struck supply columns, turning fuel trucks into fireballs and leaving German units stranded without gasoline. They hunted individual tanks, diving again and again until rockets found their targets and another Panther exploded in flames. For the German soldiers on the ground, the experience was nightmarish. There was nowhere to hide, no way to escape the planes that seemed to be everywhere at once. The Panthers, so effective when they could engage enemy tanks at long range with their powerful guns, were helpless against attacks from above. Their thick frontal armour meant nothing against rockets that struck from overhead or bombs that exploded nearby. Panzer grenadiers who had been advancing on foot scattered into ditches and buildings, abandoning their attack to save their own lives. Truck drivers leaped from their vehicles and ran, knowing that a fuel truck was a priority target for any pilot who spotted it. The German offensive, already staggered by 3 days of ground combat, was now being systematically destroyed from the air. The American ground forces, coordinating closely with the airstrikes, took advantage of the chaos to launch counterattacks of their own. Sherman platoons that had been in defensive positions for 3 days now moved forward, seeking out German units that were pinned down or demoralized and destroying them. Artillery fire intensified, with American guns pounding any German positions that were identified. The carefully prepared defensive battle was transforming into an aggressive pursuit, with the Americans pressing their advantage and giving the Germans no time to recover or reorganize. September 22nd brought the climax of the battle. The Germans, despite everything that had happened, made one more major attempt to break through. It was an act of desperation more than anything else, a refusal to accept that the offensive had failed, a determination to keep attacking until something broke. Fresh units from the 111th Panzer Brigade joined the assault, attacking from the north in an attempt to outflank the American positions around Arracourt. The attack fell initially on American cavalry screening forces, lightly armed reconnaissance units that were quickly overwhelmed by the mass of German armour pushing toward them. For a brief moment, it looked like the Germans might finally achieve the breakthrough they had been seeking for 4 days. But the American response was swift and coordinated. Tank destroyer units rushed to plug the gap, taking up firing positions that would allow them to engage the advancing Panthers from the flank. Sherman battalions manoeuvred to support them, creating a defensive line where none had existed minutes before. Most critically, as soon as the fog lifted and German positions were identified, American artillery opened up with overwhelming fire. Hundreds of shells rained down on the attacking German forces, disrupting their advance and forcing them to spread out and seek cover. Fighter bombers, already in the area from the previous day's successes, were redirected to the new threat and arrived within minutes to add their weight to the defence. The German attack dissolved under this combined onslaught. Panthers that tried to push forward were destroyed by tank destroyers waiting in ambush or blown apart by air-delivered rockets. Infantry support, essential for protecting the tanks from close-range threats, was shredded by artillery fire and never reached the American lines. German commanders, trying to coordinate the attack and maintain momentum, found their communications disrupted and their units scattered across the battlefield with no cohesion. By the afternoon, the attack had clearly failed, and by evening the Germans were retreating, leaving dozens more wrecked Panthers behind them. Through all of these desperate days, one American unit had distinguished itself above all others. The 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, had been in the thick of the fighting from the very beginning. Abrams was a tanker's tanker, a commander who led from the front and had an instinctive understanding of armoured warfare. His battalion had fought at Mayen Vale, at Les, at Arracourt itself, always where the fighting was heaviest, always where the need was greatest. His Shermans moved like wolves, striking from unexpected directions, never allowing the Germans to predict where they would appear next, always coordinating their attacks with artillery and air support to maximize their effectiveness. The men of the 37th Tank Battalion lost 14 Shermans during the battle, but they destroyed 55 German tanks in return, an exchange ratio that was almost unbelievable given the technical superiority of the Panthers they were fighting. Abrams himself became legendary, his name spoken with respect not just in his own division, but throughout the Third Army. In later years, when the US Army developed a new main battle tank to replace the aging M60, they would name it the M1 Abrams, a tribute to the leadership and skill demonstrated in battles like Arracourt. But in September 1944, he was just a lieutenant colonel doing his job, leading his men with courage and intelligence, turning disadvantage into victory through sheer determination and tactical excellence. By September 25th, the Battle of Arracourt was effectively over. The Germans still had tanks, still made occasional probing attacks, but the momentum was gone, the strength was exhausted, and the will to continue was fading. Unit after unit pulled back, abandoning their positions in Lorraine and retreating toward the Rhine and the relative safety of the German border. The offensive that was supposed to throw Patton back, supposed to retake Luneville and restore German control of eastern France, had instead resulted in the destruction of German armoured power in this sector. The final tally was staggering. 285 German tanks and armoured vehicles destroyed or abandoned, representing the complete destruction of multiple panzer brigades. The Americans, by contrast, had lost 25 Shermans and 7 tank destroyers, a remarkably small price to pay for such a decisive victory. Even accounting for American tanks that were damaged but repaired and returned to service, the exchange ratio was something like 10-1 in favour of the supposedly inferior American force. It was the kind of victory that changed perceptions, that forced military analysts to reevaluate their assumptions about tank combat, that proved once and for all that the quality of crews and the integration of combined arms could overcome significant disadvantages in equipment. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw fury and recrimination in the German command. Hitler, enraged by the failure and looking for scapegoats, relieved Army Group G commander Johannes Blaskowitz, though Blaskowitz had little to do with the tactical failures that had doomed the offensive. The truth was that the attack had been flawed from its conception, launched with inadequate forces, insufficient training, poor reconnaissance, and unrealistic expectations. No amount of command changes could fix fundamental problems of doctrine and preparation. The German military, once the most formidable fighting force in Europe, was being revealed as increasingly hollow, still capable of fierce resistance, but no longer able to mount successful offensive operations against a determined and well-coordinated enemy. For the American forces, victory brought both celebration and frustration. They had proven themselves in the largest tank battle yet fought on the Western Front, had demonstrated that American tactics and American soldiers could defeat Germany's best equipment and vaunted armoured doctrine. The men of the 4th Armoured Division knew they had accomplished something significant, had written themselves into the history of armoured warfare. Yet their triumph was incomplete. Fuel shortages and ammunition limitations, the result of Allied supply priorities that favoured Montgomery's operations to the north, prevented them from exploiting their victory. The road into Germany lay open before them. The German forces in Lorraine were shattered and demoralised. Yet they couldn't advance because their tanks were literally out of gas. Patton, characteristically furious at the situation, raged at his superiors and at the supply officers, but there was nothing to be done. The victory at Arracourt couldn't be turned into a breakthrough that might have shortened the war. Still, the battle's significance extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. For military theorists and historians studying the campaign, Arracourt became a case study in what made armoured forces effective. It demonstrated conclusively that tanks didn't fight in isolation, that the coordination of air power, artillery, and infantry support was more important than the characteristics of individual vehicles. It showed that training and experience mattered more than mechanical superiority, that veteran crews in adequate tanks would defeat green crews in superior tanks almost every time. It validated the American approach to armoured warfare, which emphasized flexibility, combined arms integration, and overwhelming firepower over the German focus on technical excellence and shock action. The battle also revealed the bankruptcy of German military thought in this phase of the war. The Germans were still fighting as if it were 1940, still believing that massed armour alone could win battles, still trying to achieve victory through operational manoeuvre rather than the systematic application of superior resources. This might have worked when Germany had experienced crews, adequate fuel, and the initiative, but by 1944 none of those conditions applied. Every German offensive in this period, from Mortain to Arracourt to the upcoming disaster in the Ardennes, would fail for similar reasons: inadequate preparation, insufficient resources, and an unwillingness to accept that the nature of the war had changed. For the soldiers who fought at Arracourt, the battle left memories that would last a lifetime. Tank crews remembered the fog, the sudden appearance of Panthers emerging from the mist, the terror of knowing you were facing a machine that could kill you before you could kill it, and the fierce satisfaction of watching those Panthers burn anyway. They remembered comrades who hadn't made it, whose tanks had taken a hit in the wrong place or at the wrong angle, who had died in fire or explosion or the slow suffocation of being trapped in a disabled tank. They remembered the exhaustion of days of continuous fighting, of catching sleep in snatches inside the tank or underneath it, of eating cold rations and drinking water that tasted like gasoline because everything in a tank smelled like gasoline eventually. They also remembered moments of triumph, of incredible bravery and skill, of watching Major Carpenter's tiny plane diving at Panthers with jury-rigged rockets, of seeing a perfect shot from a Sherman knock out a Panther that had been thought invulnerable, of the coordination that allowed them to work as a team rather than as individuals. These were professional soldiers now, veterans of multiple campaigns, men who understood their trade and took pride in doing it well. The victory at Arracourt was validation of everything they had learned and trained for, proof that they were as good as any soldiers in the world. In Germany, the defeat was absorbed into the growing catalogue of disasters that marked the autumn of 1944. Another offensive had failed. More irreplaceable tanks had been lost. More territory had been abandoned. The Panther, which was supposed to restore German superiority in armoured warfare, had proven vulnerable when wielded by inexperienced crews against determined opposition. The lesson should have been clear. Germany could no longer win through offensive action, could no longer hope to throw the Allies back through counterattack. The only realistic strategy was defensive, to make the Allies pay the highest possible price for every mile of German territory they took, to hold out and hope that the alliance would fracture or that some political solution might be negotiated. But Hitler wasn't interested in defensive strategies or negotiated settlements, and so the German military would continue to launch offensives it couldn't win, bleeding away strength that might have been better used in defense. The French countryside around Arracourt slowly returned to something resembling peace. The sounds of battle faded, replaced by the normal noises of rural life, farmers returning to tend their fields, families emerging from cellars where they had hidden during the fighting. But the scars remained, visible in the shell craters pocking the fields, in the burned-out vehicles that would take years to clear away, in the graves marked with makeshift crosses or stars of David. The people who lived there would remember September 1944 for the rest of their lives, would tell their children and grandchildren about the Americans and Germans who had fought a terrible battle in their fields and villages, would point out locations where tanks had burned or where heroic actions had taken place. For the American military, the lessons of Arracourt were studied, analysed and incorporated into doctrine. The battle became required reading at armour schools, used to teach new generations of officers about the importance of combined arms, the value of experience and training, the ways that seemingly inferior equipment could win when employed intelligently. Creighton Abrams's tactics were dissected and used as models for how armoured units should fight. The coordination between ground and air forces that had been so effective was systematised and improved. The US Army that emerged from World War II carried forward the lessons learned in places like Arracourt, lessons that would inform American military thinking for decades to come. As the decades passed and the veterans grew old, Arracourt remained in their memories as a defining moment, a battle where they had faced supposedly superior opponents and had won decisively, where courage and skill had overcome technical disadvantage, where everything they had trained for had come together perfectly. In reunions and memoirs, in interviews and histories, they would return again and again to those fog-shrouded days in Lorraine, to the moment when American armour came of age, when the myth of German invincibility was shattered, when they had proven themselves against the best the enemy could throw at them. Today, visitors to the region can still trace the outlines of the battle, can visit the towns where the fighting raged, can stand in the fields where tanks clashed and imagine what it must have been like. There are monuments and memorials, plaques marking significant locations, small museums preserving artifacts and memories. The land itself has healed, the craters filled in, the wreckage removed, the scars of battle erased by decades of peaceful farming. But the memory endures, kept alive by historians and descendants, by those who understand that what happened at Arracourt in September 1944 mattered, that it revealed something fundamental about warfare and about the human spirit. The battle demonstrated truths that remain relevant regardless of technology or era. Victory doesn't automatically go to the side with the best equipment or the most impressive weapons systems. It goes to the side that prepares better, that trains its people more thoroughly, that coordinates its efforts more effectively, that adapts more quickly to changing circumstances. It goes to the side that understands that warfare is fundamentally a human endeavour, that the quality of soldiers and the intelligence of leadership matter more than the specifications of machines, The Germans had the better tanks at Arracourt, but they didn't have better soldiers, didn't have better tactics, didn't have better preparation, and so they lost. This lesson has been relearned throughout military history, yet somehow it's always surprising when it happens, always seems to catch the side with superior technology off guard. The temptation to believe that the newest weapon or the most advanced system will guarantee victory is persistent and seductive. Arracourt stands as a reminder that this temptation should be resisted, that wars are won by people and not by machines, that the unglamorous work of training and preparation and coordination matters more than technological sophistication. The Americans who fought there didn't win because their tanks were better. They won because they were better soldiers, and that made all the difference.